want to look at the story of Balaam, and it's found in Numbers chapter 22. And I'm going to read a little bit from verse 34 and 35. You know, he's the guy with the donkey. You know, the donkey that talked, that chap. Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are displeased, I will go back. The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but speak only what I tell you. So Balaam went with Balak's officials. So here's Balaam. He's a false prophet and a bad man. But we make that decision based on what the New Testament says about him. And we're kind of prejudged. And Peter and Jude and John, they refer to the way of Balaam. And it's described as when you go against God for personal gain or financial profit. And in Revelation it says, you have those among you who follow the doctrine of Balaam. But when you read the actual story, you do see glimpses of a different side of Balaam's life. Some points of nobility of character, integrity. And he's very human as well, very understandable. You see, he realizes that he's made a mistake, and he offered, in this passage here, he offers to retrace his steps. And so he's asking God for guidance, and he sticks to what God says in the face of King Balak offering him money to do otherwise. And he says, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God. Then he says, I pray to die the death of the righteous, that my last end may be like his. That's not too bad, is it? That kind of stuff. Surely. And yet, obviously, he's a villain. And I want to think about why that's the case. And there's a bit of a slide here. So here's the question. How do people who are apparently respectable and gifted and honourable and spiritually aware, how do they go to the bad? How does it go? How do people head off into the darkness when you think they've got it really together? What's the process? This is so that you can avoid it, not how you can follow it. So the story tells, as you probably know, about this king Balak, and he sends for Balaam to curse the Israelites. The Israelites are coming towards him, and he calls on this local guy who is well known as a seer or a magician or a soothsayer. This was commonplace in ancient history, and they would bless and curse, they would foretell events, and Balaam was one of those kind of guys. So does that mean he was an imposter or a charlatan, or was he a sort of a man of cunning insight, political nous, who had his eye open for the main chance, a kind of Derren Brown with attitude? Or did he alternatively have secret dealings with the devil? Well, no, the Bible says he was inspired by God. That's interesting, isn't it? The Bible says his inspiration came from God. Well, I guess that all our gifts come from God. If God is the creator, then he creates every person as he wishes, and he gives us our gift. Here's somebody with sports ability, and here's somebody with artistic ability or musical ability, and then here's somebody else with teaching ability, talking ability, or listening, or understanding, or logic ability. And the Bible refers to the inspiration of the poet and the inspiration of the prophet in the same kind of way. It comes from God. Well, that's reasonable. It even says that the guy who was the goldsmith at the temple was inspired, was filled with the Spirit of God to do his work. So it doesn't make any distinction between what's sacred inspiration, you might say, or secular inspiration, except for one thing: how that gift is used. That's how you differentiate. So God's prophets glorified God, and the false prophets, like Balaam, glorified themselves. But the inspiration was real. The inspiration came from God. So what am I saying? Simply this: Balaam had a gift, but he twisted it for his own purposes. And that purpose is pretty clear in Numbers 22, it was to make money and to make a name for himself. And God's prophets were quite different. They didn't boost their self-image. They didn't have any fancy razzmatazz. Here comes the prophet of the Most High God. No, no, no. They were saying God dwells with the one who is lowly and humble of heart. And they didn't push themselves or their own agenda. They emphasized their total dependence on God. And so the prophets of God, the true prophets, were quite humble people of themselves, but passionately big when they were talking about what God was doing. Do you see the difference? Does the gift in your life that God's given you, does it glorify God, or are you manipulating it to glorify yourself? Well, give it some thought, and we'll come back to this later. God bless.